your Bytes Your Rights, a weekly live discussion and podcast about data ownership, digital rights, and your privacy. This week we're discussing privacy engineering. Are we engineering privacy into our tech? I'm here with my co-host, Christian Kamir, managing partner of Sustaining Capital, a VC fund that focuses on blockchain technology. Chris is a privacy advocate and has a big interest in identity solutions and the future of money. He's done some amazing work on analyzing the problems with central bank digital currencies. Say hello, Chris.
Hey. Yeah, actually I'm trying to build the web for the first time. My thesis is that our species' success is based on collaboration. And the primary technology for that is language, and the primary technology to distribute language is the World Wide Web, which unfortunately we never built. And so as far as money is concerned, money is just the language of value, and that's what we're gonna fix first because it's the easiest primitive. Back to the studio.
Thanks, Chris. And of course, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Jeff Jokish of Privacy Plan, a data privacy researcher. So the premise here today is that new privacy laws are rushing at us. New threats to privacy, though, seem to be also hitting us daily. I can't really tell if we're moving forward or moving backward. So I think it's a good time to stop and evaluate where we are. There are a hell of a lot of privacy professionals in the world now. I forget the exact number, but I think the International Association of Privacy Professionals, they certainly passed 70,000 privacy professionals. I think it may be past 90,000 privacy professionals now. And privacy engineering is a thing, but is it enough of a thing? Privacy by Design, a concept pioneered by Anne Kevorkian, is now 27 years old, with the design framework being published 13 years ago. The IAPP has been certifying CIPTs, right, the Certified Information Privacy Technologist, since 2004, nearly 2 decades. But that cert gets a whole lot less attention than this Certified Information Privacy Professional for the United States, for Europe, for Canada, for South America, and also the CIPM, the Certified Information Privacy Management certs. As far as I know, I think those are much more popular and attained. So, and then finally, we've got the Privacy Engineers Manifesto that was first published in 2007 and co-authored by one of our panelists who hopefully is going to be joining with us soon, Michelle Dennedy. And finally, a recent informal survey of privacy professionals and engineers that I conducted, we estimated that less than 1% of engineers actually know much of anything about privacy. Most of them, as far as we understood, don't even really understand data security, or at least are trained well in data security. So this seems like a big problem to me. How do we build safe private systems if our engineers don't understand how to do that? So let's introduce our panelists, at least the ones we have online already, and try to find some answers. So currently we have with us Celia Kiernan, CEO of Ethica, and the guy behind the open source FIDES system. And we have Taylor Beck with us, staff privacy architect at Uber, an incredibly accomplished privacy engineer. And we're going to have a couple more people joining us, but let's start with these two. And the first question to you, gentlemen, let's start out with a little introduction and have each of you tell us something interesting about your personal connection with privacy engineering, if that's not too tough of a question. Maybe sure. Go ahead, Taylor. Either of you.
Nope. Sure, I can go first. My personal connection with privacy, I've been in privacy now for a little over 12 years. I've done many roles across the privacy industry. What has drawn me to privacy engineering is, I've witnessed how it started kind of in a legal framework where privacy was the domain of lawyers, and they were providing advice out to the business, and the business was quietly nodding its head and saying sure, and ultimately whatever guidance they were given wasn't really kind of flowing down to the endpoints, if you will, of the software development life cycle. And we would products would go into the market, and you would find out later, it's like, oh, we told you to do this, you said you were going to do it, but then you realized that there was no way for me to actually validate you were doing it. So ultimately, it was more of an exercise in risk management than it was in actually building products that were privacy forward. So as I've kind of evolved through my career, I've kind of moved down into the engineering kind of level, because that's, ultimately when it comes down to brass tacks, when you're processing data, that's where your control frameworks need to be, not up at your policy level.
That's interesting. Interesting. So, Liam, thoughts there?
Sure. So, and I'll only correct only because I want to make sure I don't say it. So it's Killian.
I'm sorry.
Just it happens all the time. It's quintessentially Irish name. So I'm Killian Kieran. I'm the founder and CEO of Ethica. Lots of unpronounceable names. So my name's Killian. The company's Ethica, and the product is Fides. It's named after the Roman goddess of trust. My relationship with privacy is my career has been 20 years in one form or another in data analytics and enterprise infrastructure related to data analytics. My first encounter with privacy as a privacy unsophisticated data engineer was probably 8 years ago, working with a very large household brand where they were attempting to comply with a future state regulation being the GDPR. I found it to be a bizarre process, as Taylor alluded to, of essentially mechanical Turking compliance, right, checkboxes, and at the end of which we hadn't shipped a single new line of code that made our product more compliant. We were just checking lots of boxes, and I found that to be a very, very curious way to make a system safe or private or ethical by design. And as Taylor said, right, like ultimately, where the rubber meets the road on the problem of privacy, you can write as many policies as you like. It's where you actually make changes to infrastructure or systems that process data or make decisions with data on behalf of the users that own it. And so that's why we started working on this problem.
Jeff, you're muted, Jeff, if you're trying to say something.
Sorry, apologies. I'm trying to get a couple of our other guests online. The second question that I wanted to pose was really sort of similar to the question that you gentlemen just started addressing, right? And that is, it seems as though there's a little bit of a disconnect, right, between what I sort of think of as theoretical privacy, or the legal and the compliance world, versus the applied privacy world, or the privacy engineering world. Do you guys care to sort of delve into that a little bit? Is there still a disconnect? How do we bridge those two worlds?
I'll take the first stab at that. There is to some extent a disconnect, but it depends on all of the organization you're in. Privacy has to come from a top-down and bottom-up culture to ensure that you're kind of meeting things across the board. Some organizations, privacy is a priority. It's a matter of trust. It's a matter of brand. It equates with your brand and your success in the marketplace. For others, it's not necessarily something that's cared about. So you'll see across different organizations, different companies, that there's different approaches where you may have those gaps or you may not have those gaps. How you organize your programs, where you place your assets for your programs, whether what orgs they're in, how connected they are to overall objectives for organizations, is critical to ensure that it's a front of mind across your business, and not just something that's to Killian's point, a check your boxes exercise that audit or legal's coming through and saying, are we doing this, and let's get it on paper and move it along. So if you want to embed that kind of ethos into your engineering org, you need to be sitting kind of in your engineering org. You need to be having those conversations with your eng leaders, and you need to be building the processes and structures that allow you to provide that guidance at the design level as part of your design review processes, rather than coming in at the end right before launch and saying, oh, wait a minute, we need to change these things, because you're never going to change things when you're approaching launch, and you're going to delay a launch.
Yeah, I have a kind of a strategic or topology question in a way. So my position is, by default, users have the inherent right not to be observed. And I expect this to ultimately be the case for all digital technologies. I assume that's rather impractical right now, but can you envision that this is going to be the default in the future, as in whenever I engage with any kind of digital technology, I have granular control over the data that I'm sharing and or the data that I know this entity has?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in, and also echo Taylor's point and answer yours, Chris, which is, I guess there's two parts to this, right? There's your expectations, you decided your individual expectation that you've never observed or shouldn't be observed, or have the ability to control what is observed about you. For what it's worth, we sit on the same page here. I believe that as an individual, I should have absolute right over what I share. Part of the issue, of course, is end user understanding of the implication of what they share at the sort of very granular level, like conceptually it's very complicated. And I think there's a cultural gap there. And what I mean is the average consumer that doesn't work in our bubble of tech assumes that clever engineers are building safe systems, right? Like that's sort of almost a cultural myth. Then there's the technical reality, right? I don't think any engineer sets out to do ill for the most part. I believe that actually engineers want to build brilliant products, brilliant systems that offer great services. I really do believe that. That's why we become engineers. I think it's technically difficult to do because you need the left side and the right side of the brain, or the legal and the engineering side, to accomplish this today. Like translating the complex concepts of policy or individuals' users' rights into software systems is a really difficult problem. That's what Taylor alluded to. And increasingly we're seeing like efforts around privacy by design entering the sort of product design phase. But that's going to trickle through to being like repeatable, reproducible engineering tools that are easy to use, so engineers don't have to keep rolling their own solutions all the time. But culturally, we should be aiming to allow an individual complete control over their data. I think technically we're still a long way from that.
Chris, I think we have Michelle and maybe Gabe in as attendees. Can you promote them up?
Yeah, on it.
That's insightful, Killian. What percentage of engineers can we really expect? Hey, Michelle, great to see you. Sorry, you're muted.
For the best. You can't hear my cursing at the sign.
Sorry, we had a little bit of a technical difficulty getting you in here. We've been talking a little bit about the difference between sort of the theoretical privacy world of legal and finance and compliance, and the applied privacy world of privacy engineering. And the question that I was just about to pose to Killian is, what percentage of engineers can we really expect have all of those skills to be able to be that sort of privacy engineer that can sort of bridge that whole world, that have that sort of creative side and that engineering side, that can really be a privacy engineer? Is that a big percent, or is that a very small percentage?
I mean, speaking very personally, I think the goal for us culturally as an industry should be to aim for 100%. And that might sound naive, but bear with me. The car is security, right? Like 10 years ago, engineers didn't think about security. It doesn't mean they didn't care about it, but it was something that happened after the software development process. And Michelle has written endlessly about this. And it was sort of like the ugly cousin of software development, right? Now, to be a good engineer, in air quotes, is to think about threat modeling and to develop through the secure software development lifecycle. It's a given. It's like just a hygiene factor. The same has to happen in privacy. It doesn't mean that every engineer should be a lawyer and understand 380 odd pages of the GDPR, but there are common principles and concepts, whether you read sort of the principles of privacy by design or like a primer on privacy as a sort of issue, whether it's the CPRA or the GDPR, that apply to every engineer. And I think that can be made common and should be common to every.
Yeah, in my experience, engineers care a lot about privacy. They just don't really understand it very well. So what we've generally focused on in my career is teaching engineers first principles of privacy, your fair information practices. Those are things they can understand and kind of get on board with. And then that greatly reduces the amount of kind of oversight you need to run on them, because they're thinking about how they're going to structure their systems on these first principles, and then you can nuance the finer compliance notes at the end without making major impacts to overall system architectures.
Let's go back, since we missed the entrance with Michelle. Michelle, one of the questions that we asked the panelists when we first arrived was to give a little introduction and to sort of tell us a little bit something about you, your personal connection to privacy. And we actually didn't introduce you. You're the CEO of Privacy Code and the co-author of the Privacy Engineers Manifesto. So could you give us a little introduction to your personal connection to privacy engineering, which I think is probably a couple of volumes, but maybe you could.
I'm old, is what you're saying, Jeff. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's this is the perfect cadre, and I echo. I was able to hear the introductory remarks while I was like a participant trying to get on board. So I think this is the perfect cadre. So I come at it. I tell people I was raised on a raised floor, and my dad was a security and technology architect, starting from UNIVAC. He started in the Navy, so we had very early access to compute. And both he and my mother are intellectual property lawyers. My dad as a hobby, so then he would be a computer architect, and people have weird hobbies. He was a patent litigator and patent agent. What does it say? They don't really aggregate. I can't read the whole chat. But in any event, when I was coming up on the raised floor in about 1974, there was a book called The Right to Privacy, and it was talking about mostly governmental controls and the laws that were coming out. I'm not that old. I was a grade school kid at this point, but at this point was when the pivot in the discussion about what is the publicus, which is your public interface that you have to kind of give to live in an organized society, and your privatus, which is your, who are you as a person. So the right to privacy, as stated in U.S. jurisprudence about the right to be left alone, actually doesn't end at the right to be left alone. It's really the right to be left alone to live your life with dignity and self-sovereignty. So the way I look at this is very much as, yep, there's publicus, there's fides, there's trust, there's personal, there's ethics. Sounds like it's very ephemeral. It sounds like it's, old school Latin and very policy wonky. And then there's the raised floor. What is the capacity to protect data at any given point? What is the availability of the soft system to have the incentives to act in certain ways? And I 100% agree with Killian's statement that someday we will not have security engineers. Someday we won't have privacy engineers. They'll just be called engineers. And so part of when Dad and I started talking about what would it take to actually do these privacy by design principles, because they're great and they're aspirational and they're public policy things, but when you get down to like going to your workbench on Monday, what do they mean? We talked about, is it a privacy innovator? Is it a privacy designer? And we landed on privacy engineer because the throwback was to professional engineer. So a professional engineer, and they still exist, but mostly in the civil engineering world, there's a code of conduct. There are ethics involved. You don't harm people. You test things before you let them GA because you don't want to cause harm, but you also want to prove that the build will work. So a privacy engineer is the future civil engineering for the data infrastructure, and we have to do it with ethics. We have to do it with repeatable systems and rules, and we have to know the definition of done so that we can iterate and not just sort of throw words at a technical problem and don't throw technology at a societal problem. So it's kind of a gobbledygook mouthful, but that's where I come from, and I get very deeply pragmatic and say, what's the culture, what's the budget, what are the tools, let's go.
That was a deep answer. I see a lot of head nodding.
It's like we're all speaking to the same choir, right? Yeah. And there's a lot of build. I mean, Kelly and I are both on the shift left side, and it's like, oh no, what's he doing? And I looked and I was like, okay, good. We are like kissing cousins. Like we work together in the stack. There's a lot of tech that does not yet exist in the rise of privacy tech, and so there are tools. Every single day, I'm talking to a new company, and only 75% of them are a new data vault. The other 25% are other parts of making this so that every engineer knows what to do, knows what the interface is, knows what the definition of done and success is, and every business person actually can start advocating to buy the tools, to get the outcomes, to put it on your 10K report with pride that you're actually doing privacy engineering. And it's not because you want to avoid being sued. It's because you proactively, you want to respect people. And I'll give you my one soundbite that I've said now for 20 plus years is there's only one company, one type of company that needs privacy engineering. It's a narrow thing, so you might want to get your pencil out. Only one type of company is going to buy privacy technology. That type of company, I'll say it again in one clean sentence, is a company that has employees and customers or wants to have employees or customers. All the other groups, they may not want what we have, but everyone who has customers or employees or citizens, voters, if you're in a governmental, only those organizations need to have privacy engineering, i.e. startups, yes. Not-for-profit, yes. For-profit, yes. Government, yes. If you deal with people, you must privacy engineer respect into the system.
Is privacy as code? Is that the best way? The only way? Is that the way companies need to implement privacy and do privacy engineering at the code level?
Well, we're biased. I mean, hell yes, it's our answer.
I mean, I think so. I think so too, right? But is that what everybody should be doing?
There is, to jump in, there is no other way to do it. Not to sound absolutist, but I think there's someone in the chat, and apologies, I'm paraphrasing poorly, but I mean Claudio has asked, why are there so many? I think if I'm paraphrasing correctly, lawyers don't really understand the sort of technical controls of privacy. So why are there so many in the field? Well, because privacy today is treated like regulatory compliance, but it's an engineering problem, right? Like you fall out of compliance because systems can't perform or behave in a certain way. Like ultimately privacy is a non-functional requirement. So it means it should be a default feature of the system. Like it's a given, it should just exist by default. It doesn't, so you spend lots of time doing sort of mechanical turking work. It has to be built into the system. It's the only way to get there. And Michelle mentioned this idea that privacy engineers are civil engineers. I use this like trite cliche constantly. Software developers, we used to be called software developers, like to be called software engineers. Software engineers are contemporary society civil engineers. Like you build contemporary society civil infrastructure. You don't need civil engineers building bridges with t-shirts saying move fast and break things, right? Because you'd never cross that bridge. Like you would just never walk across that bridge. It isn't okay to build systems and ask hundreds of millions of people to use them and not make them structurally sound. And this is structural rigidity. That's what it is, right? It's the safety of the users that are on it.
So I have a question directly for Taylor, and you can tell me that you can talk about it, that's fine. But I think a lot of people saw the recent kind of docudrama about Uber and the whole God mode thing. Have you been exposed to that? And when you started at the company, or at that point in time, there were already strict limitations on that kind of location information?
Well, I don't want to go into too much detail about my current employment, but what I can say is I was quite pleasantly surprised by the working environment at Uber, given the previous reputation. I have not personally experienced anything that is remotely related to how the company was run in the past.
Yeah, I mean, that's some of the most sensitive information, obviously, if you know where a person is going, where he or she is going to be in the next 10 minutes.
Yeah. I mean, I can't speak specifically to what our current implementations are, but, privacy is taken very seriously at Uber, partially because we have a consent decree, but also now because it's the right thing to do.
Right.
And it's culturally inherent in our organization.
Yeah. I mean, you might not be the right person for this question, but so are you now required to permanently delete this information, or how do you handle that specifically, like the A to B information about a person?
So we're not required to delete it, but we're required to review everything that goes into production and processes personal information from a privacy standpoint, at the product level and at the engineering level. So we have a privacy impact assessment process as well as a technical privacy consulting review process that and defines technical controls to our point earlier, or the discussion earlier. Privacy is code. You can write retention policies, you can write access policies, you can write all of these things, but if you go to every engineer in your company, they wouldn't even be able to tell you where they could find the retention policy to tell you how long they should retain something for.
One of the I'm a big proponent of data minimization, but even more than that, I think one of the big problems that we have is copies of data. I don't mind giving my data to a company. What I hate is knowing that that company is going to give it to 10 other companies, and those companies are potentially going to give it to 10 more companies. And that proliferation of data is the big problem. Maybe not with brands themselves, but data brokers, I think, right, is a big problem. How does privacy engineering and maybe what is your opinion as privacy engineers on how we can stop the copying of data and improve data minimization? Is there anything I don't know, tangible or consequential or embedded in the principles of privacy engineering that affects that particular concept?
So I would say that yes, there is. Data minimization is one of those first principles we try to embed in all of our engineers' ethos as they're looking at system design. That being said, there is a legacy of technical privacy debt of how systems are structured, how dependencies exist with third parties in developing, as it pertains to advertising or as it pertains to general services. And there are existing contractual controls you can put in place, but that doesn't stop the proliferation of data. So ultimately, from a long-term perspective, as you're strategically looking at your architecture and your implementations, you want to reduce what you're collecting, you want to hold it for less time, and then when you have to share it, you want to share it in using mechanisms that aren't proliferating, personal information, but rather perturbations of personal information. Can you hash it? Can you accomplish the same goals without using repeatable GUIDs or UUIDs that can be matched across different systems, across different companies, so that you are maintaining a structure where the sharing of that personal data between you and another company cannot be used in an extended space down a daisy chain of other implementations or companies.
Yes.
I think I'd echo what Taylor has covered there and say, without trying to drill too far into the technical weeds of it, data will always be shared. I'm not saying that's good or bad. I just mean it will be, for legitimate reasons, maybe shared across some processors and vendors, right? Like there are legitimate reasons why that's to happen to provide a service to a human. I think one of the things we're missing is sort of a reasonably well-defined standard interoperable way of understanding data between systems. Like one of the issues is, if let's say, Jeff, you say delete me from across your systems, that is only possible if our definition of what Jeff's data is the same as Taylor's, right? So that we can send a signal to Taylor to delete those records, right? There are massive inconsistencies in the way data is modeled and managed as it relates to personal information. Today we have API documentation and Swagger docs that really well define an API. We have contracts for data processing agreements, but those two don't join together, even though API is effectively a contract. So we need to join those together more tightly, right? The sort of definition of what happens inside a system from a privacy perspective, let's not use the word compliance, and from an engineering standpoint, need to be bound together, right? So you can enforce those decisions across this.
Right. So it's not just data minimization, but also talking about retention and.
Yeah, it's both aspects, right? Like ostensibly, if you have codified policy decisions into APIs, you can also minimize access, right? Because then you get semantic access controls. You can say, well, this system can't have Jeff's personal categories of data, like sensitive stuff like biometrics and healthcare, because it's not permitted to for these purposes of use. That's impossible for it to say, because purposes of use don't exist as a concept on API, right? So we don't have these standard concepts to achieve like minimization, enforced minimization.
Right. All right. I want to explore that further, but we've got a couple of things popping up here. People popping up here. Gabriel Gums, I'd like to introduce him. He's another panelist. And he is the co-host of Privacy Please podcast, and also works with Myota. And I forget, Gabe, what your role is there now. I think you're CTO. Is that right?
I am Chief Product Officer at Myota, yes. Yeah,
Oh,
that's,
great. Well, introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your connection to privacy engineering.
yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned I co-host a podcast on privacy and security as well. I've been in InfoSec for quite some time, a rough 21 years as the case may be. Data security specifically for a significant part of that, easily half of that. But as privacy engineering goes, as kind of the lead product person in my organization, I take those kinds of things rather seriously. I also run a very small GitHub project, which is just a curated list of resources on the topic. So the awesome privacy engineering project on GitHub has a whole bunch of resources that I've been curating over the years that I decided to share with folks that have a whole lot of questions on these topics.
All right, hey Maria.
Hi. So sorry. Thank you so much. So they have a dump truck that was taking some gravel to the pool because they're remodeling the pool, and that spilled on some of the cars in that row right there. So
We got a privacy violation.
Privacy violation.
check if there was any damage. I have a little nick on the window.
Hey, Chris,
Oh,
can you Maria there,
That's not too
please?
bad.
Okay, I wasn't quite sure how this information fit into the discussion.
You know what though? That's like every dev team. Every dev team backs up a gravel truck and nicks your windshield. You gotta replan.
Yeah, once in a while that happens. But I had a practical question, and I presume I know the answer, but my general position is I don't know anything about anything. So when we look at projects here, and we look at dozens of projects every week, I have the due diligence test, obviously, how these projects are treating data. And long term, my position is that you should treat every data point as its own cryptographic primitive that its primary ownership is assigned to the one that's actually creating it. I'll loosely call this, I want to own all my digital dust. The question that I have though specifically is like from all of yours perspective, and I'm gonna like go around the table so to speak and start with Taylor. How practical is that at the moment? Meaning, what pieces of data could you treat in this way that you could actually create like its own cryptographic primitive out of this, where you could assign ownership to that? And if that's too obscure, I can explain what I mean by that.
Yeah, why don't you give me a little broader explanation of that?
Oh, so what most people don't quite realize that what Bitcoin introduced is really property rights to data, right? So you have your own private key, and that lets you control a set of data, and blockchain-based solution allow you to change control over a set of data from one address to another. So that is really the important primitive, because obviously bytes don't really care if you call them bitcoins or CryptoKitties or US dollars or try to assign a color to them, right? So point there being is my long-term expectation is that we treat all of this data in this particular way, and starting with the most sensitive data, as you can see now, like biometrics, for example, just store this on your enclave, on your iPhone, because yes, you obviously don't want copies out of that, right?
Yeah. So I think we're on a path to where you can have that kind of ownership from a federated identity system, from a blockchain system where you can exercise that ownership. I think there's a lot of kinks that need to be worked out in the system going down the road. I think using, starting with something like biometrics or like a highly sensitive piece where you can manage that ownership is a good kind of proof of concept of where we could go. To my earlier point on technical privacy debt, making a system that's workable across diverse technologies that can execute and understanding the varying use cases where you might need this. There needs to be a co-development really of the identity system with the technologies trying to use. So an example would be if you're trying to use biometrics for a short-term for a very quick, identification process, you want to make sure that the identity system's got the processing speed so that the person's not just standing there waiting to get access to whichever thing they're trying to get to for a long time while the proofs are being, computed across a diverse set of nodes. So there needs to be some kind of co-development and some kind of open standard that everyone can adopt that would be able to solve the most needs across the most problems. So and I think there's a path to it. We need to scalability would be the issue, and trying to understand what the overall impacts are to implementations, whether they be a single company or a worldwide system.
Yeah. Same question for Michelle. And again, if that's too technical, then we can sure.
Not at all. So I think let's use the buzzword bingo blockchain at least 10 times so we have to say.
Yeah, and as a disclaimer, internally we sort of stopped using it because blockchains are one example of a decentralized software solution, right?
Exactly. So that's the thing is I think, but what you're illustrating comes up a lot, and it's both given me hope and given me heartburn in the privacy engineering world, because when you have sort of requirements starting from a technical point of view, and sometimes when you really get into the crypto rogue world, it's a very rigid point of view. Of course we can make it work for you, and the question is like how quickly do you want the environment to turn this lovely yellow and gray that I didn't manage to get? Because the reality is blockchain is very expensive from an environmental perspective, from an energy perspective. So if you're putting things up there that to be on indelible ledger, if you start there and then you go back to the why are we here and what are we actually protecting and what are the outcomes and what is the definition of done, you'll find that you've done something very, very heavyweight. And I come from this with scars on my back from Sun Microsystems. Like everyone needed a xenoscale system that could scale to the moon, and it turned out that after things broke down in 2001 and you could get all the scalability you wanted on eBay for pennies on the dollar, it turns out we oversold technology into a business market that hadn't grown to fit. So all of that said is I love distributed ledger for a lot of different things, but mostly for things that are indelible, like where are certain objects on the planet, like your home. Now, how many people have come in and out of my house per day does not need to go on the blockchain, but it is PII, and it's very sensitive PII. So first I'd start with your solution and figure out who the personas are in that constellation, and then work the PE thing. Now, specifically to what I think your question is really getting at is how do we all own our digital dust? How do we have some semblance of control over these various persona and pieces and bytes? And this is where we discuss the scariest word of all in the engineering world, time. Time matters, because the context of like, gee, I'm really hungry, I wish an Uber Eats would show up right now magically in front of my house, Taylor, talking to you. After that truck leaves and I've gobbled down whatever is not on my diet and I'm feeling full of regret, and you should then send me a cocktail talking to you, Taylor. My needs change. So when we talk about owning our digital rights, understanding things like your genetic makeup, that's a pretty permanent thing. I would promote that to something that I had personal control over. When it is my genetic makeup plus whatever my specialty doctor has to say about it now, given today's technology, we may want to have a shared relationship in that piece. And this is where the fetus thing is really exciting to me. I tried to do something similar back in the aughts that I was calling PML, or privacy markup language. If you know what the who is upon context, and you know what the what is that is the corpus, then you have a heck of a better time tying it to things like distributed ledger or blockchain, and you have a different way of granting or refusing permissions using these new ephemeral IP asset orchestrators like NFTs even. So instead of having something that's big and personal and forever up here, you might want to think about something that is momentary and exchangeable on a token down here. And all of that, I believe, starts with what is it that we're here to do, and what will that mean 10 weeks, months, years from now? And then how are we going to actually have those controls? To go way back to your question to Taylor earlier, Chris, of do you delete the information? I mean, define delete. That's a whole...
It comes back to the original kind of naive request from an engineering perspective, the right to be forgotten. Right, so you don't really forget anything that's digitally observed. That's basically impossible.
When that was going down in GDPR land, I'm on the record, I support it now. It's the law. I said things that have not appeared in science fiction yet have no business in policy and no business in enforceable law. The right to be forgotten. Yeah, I mean, I taught privacy law right out of law school, and as you can tell by the accent, I am from Europe, so we were about 10 years ahead of what's going on here. And at the point in time, I was general counsel for a large internet service provider, so we had 185 people in the call center that I needed to train not to answer to certain questions. Right. And even then, you cannot enforce the right to be forgotten.
Right.
Yeah. Don't lump all of us Yanks in with our legislators. Most of us are 10 years ahead of our legislators in terms of... You'd be right, though. Our legislators are certainly 10 years behind, but I think most of us privacy...
We're 50 years behind now.
Yeah, right here with you now.
So I've got a little bit of a follow-up. I think this is really down the same vein of Chris's question, but there's a study coming out from Catch, and I'm not even sure if it's public yet, but it was shared with me a couple days ago. And there's a couple findings that were really interesting, not revolutionary, but interesting. One of the findings was that 74% of people that they surveyed, and I think it was over 2,500 people, said that they highly value their data, their personal data. More people in the study highly valued their data privacy than other ethical issues like sustainability and ethical issues, which was really interesting. They also said that lack of transparency and control fed into those data concerns, and that data minimization was an important factor in their expectation of privacy. And their biggest factor impacting brand trust was data retention, which I thought was really interesting. I've never heard that before. And finally, brand preference is most impacted by transparency and data sharing. So a lot of really interesting things that it seems to me are things that we've talked about here already, right? And things that privacy engineers can potentially impact. So any thoughts on those? I mean, we've already sort of addressed them, but I just wanted to bring them up because I think the point being that you guys are actually already talking about these issues and trying to fix them. And now we've got at least another data point, set of data points that seem to confirm what we already sort of thought and what you're already working on.
The thing that jumps out in my mind when you read those stats up is, that's fascinating. That number doesn't feel like it jives with what people's behaviors are in the real world, right? Like there's still a lot more folks using Facebook than that number suggests, for example. But it's probably, like, I won't attribute it to malice and more to ignorance, right? Like I think most folks just they don't even know how they can impact their own privacy. This very conversation and the notion of, can you own your digital dust? And I'll use blockchain still because that's what we picked on, although there are other decentralized mechanisms also. I think the problem I have with that conversation in general too, though, is I already own those things. There are very few things, quote, on the blockchain or blockchain use cases that aren't just transferable of real world use cases, right? Like I already own those things. Asking me if I still own those things somehow suggests that I lost ownership of them in a digital world, which is arguably true, but if my bank decides they want to use the blockchain to manage my mortgage tomorrow, my bank and I will agree on the same things that we did in the physical space now in this digital ledger. It was still mine, it was still a physical space thing. So I think to the statistics, there's this disconnect where people think that they magically don't own those things any longer. Like somehow your likeness isn't yours because it's on the interwebs, right? Like no, just because you have it in digital form doesn't necessarily relinquish. Now, what things do I own that only exist in a cyberspace? Most of the things I could think of are as a service things, right? But even then, I might have shared some of my own personal data first. But as a service items, I own something as a service, and so maybe I generated some information with that thing as a service, and now there's new data that didn't exist before I used that service. Arguably, whatever that contract is, and I am not a lawyer, I don't even try to play one on TV. Maybe there's an agreement that says that thing is no longer yours, it's theirs, whatever. But that might represent something that was only ever in existence in a digital sense. But when I already own something, it's mine. You don't get to reassign ownership just because. And I think the problem with 71% of people respecting that is they do respect that, and they're probably thinking about in all the traditional senses of, but I own these things, and my privacy is mine, and I respect it. And I think they don't understand that they don't lose those rights, or they shouldn't lose those rights in the digital world.
Yeah, I think ultimately what the issue with what this study is saying is that people want more agency with their data. It's not so much that they own it, and we can solve for that a little bit on the engineering side, but ultimately, there's not many people that are looking under the hood. I think what that really calls for is more like privacy usability, more privacy product, and more functionality that, like, if I have to give you my email address to see the price of this product, I should be able to remove my email address from you with the same ease and not have to write a letter to a PO box in Indiana with 5 forms of ID to ask you to delete something that I only needed to give you so I could look at the price of this item. And that's a usability issue, and that's something I think we focused on privacy controls from a contractual legal framework. We focused on it. You're starting to focus on it from an engineering perspective. There are some companies out there that are starting to look at it from a product perspective, and we need to make people feel they have the agency over their data, the data they've shared with you, as a means of meeting that trust bar that they're setting.
Yeah, and I think it's also defining the sort of learned victimhood that we've trained users. Like when McNeely last century, and I keep reminding him that he said this last century, he said you have zero privacy, get over it. Now, did Scott say I have no privacy and I am over it? No, he did not. Did he say we have no privacy? We should get up? No, he said you. Now, that is reading way further into my friend Scott, and we still are friends. But in his mind, he really meant anonymity. So like the conversation that's going on in the chat, he meant secrecy. He meant if you want to engage online, you are not going to be secret while you're doing it because we're doing it online. Now, he'll still argue with me that there should be no laws because he's a rabid libertarian, and that's great. We're having these arguments about how does philosophy of what should happen impact what does happen. And when we talk about giving agency to folks that are either not as digitally literate as others, or people that are in inherently vulnerable positions, people laying in hospitals with COVID, how are they going to actually exercise these rights, and do they deserve an agent, and who should they? There's all sorts of both functional soft system issues that need to happen, and also figuring out that the definition of security, safety, anonymity, sovereignty, self-sovereignty, individual sovereignty, and then the bigger question of, and I love the European-US thing because we always forget little Asia. Asia's big, as it turns out, and collective agency that goes back a familial line 3,000 years doesn't think about an individual as I have no privacy. They think maybe about family or community or region. And what does that mean? Are we supposed to then only give agency and cluster and anonymity to a group of people? All of these are things that we can put into our architectures. How granular do we want to be? How much pressure do we put on the individual person who may or may not even be balancing their checkbook? I have agency over my checking account. I have a bear of a time getting my taxes filed, just getting all of these cloud services to give me the documents I need to give to a government that already has all this information about me in the first place, and I'm writing a piece of paper like it's 1500. So I think these are all usability questions as much as just we can't make any more proclamations about I have privacy, you don't have privacy, we can't have privacy, the technology doesn't work. It's like, let's figure out what are the instead of having a surveillance economy where 2-3 men get to choose what happens globally, we actually figure out what does a context and a consent-based economy look like? Should we have a very intimate relationship when I'm sitting in a stranger's vehicle going from my house to the airport? Well, that intimacy is over. The minute I hit the curve, have a nice day, we should then be strangers again. But for that moment in time, we're in a vehicle. We might get in an accident together. We might get stopped for speeding together. One of us might proposition the other. Probably won't be me. I'm very tired and old. But I think we need to figure out context, and that's something we can engineer around. That's something that we can measure, and that's something I think that we can have very strong OKRs that compete with one another based on those architectures.
Let's not let Scott make too many of these decisions. Libertarians tend to make bad abolitionists in general. Just as a general rule of thumb.
Well, I actually had this conversation. It was actually, this is going to sound like a huge name drop, umbrellas out, but Gosling was there, and Scott was there, and I was there sitting by his pool. And my
Gosling also a libertarian? I don't recall.
No, he's like the oldest hippie of hippies.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense.
Totally. It was all about openness, and so we're sitting there having this debate, and I'm literally in the middle of all of this, right? And I have no power, and both of these guys at that point were, if not closing in on $1 billion, maybe even past it in monetary wealth and white privilege and all of the things, all the power, all the brand, all the notoriety. At that time, they were in the peak of their powers, and I was just some little Irish chick wandering in. And my oldest was 3, and she popped out of the little. I'm totally telling tales on her. She's all grown now. She actually works for Wayfair doing privacy stuff. But at the time, she was 3. Pops out of the gatehouse naked to go to the pool. Mommy, I need help with my swimming suit. And I said to Scott, and first of all, he turns to Gosling and says, like mother, like daughter. And I was like, that's not nice. This is before me too. And I said, let's talk about privacy right now. Like, I helped her with her little bathing suit, and it was just very sweet and innocent. She gets in the pool. And I said, we are surrounded by big walls on hundreds of acres of land. So, and you've got 2 Rottweilers, and you've got physical guards, and you're very, very powerful and wealthy. And we have a small child here who just needs help getting into her bathing suit so she can enjoy a swimming pool on a hot day. We do have privacy. We demand it.
You conflated a couple of things, which I appreciate. You conflated security and privacy because you listed about 5 things, and only one of them provided privacy, the wall. The others provided security.
Well,
but
no,
you can't have one without. That's fair. That's fair. Well, we do agree. I'm certain in this panel we agree you can't have one without the other. I was picking on the. Yeah, thoroughly. It's why we host that podcast, and we don't separate those topics. Private security is like there's no way the two exist without each other. I was picking on libertarians because their general dislike of systems usually goes so far that even systems that can govern privacy tend to fall under that umbrella, which is problematic for me.
Because we think we're good people. That was part of the whole thing. There's power, there's systems, there's soft systems, there's hardware, there's a conflation of context and time and mechanism, and what are we protecting anyway? And if you are of that mindset, it's not because you're a terrible person, necessarily, some are. It's your context is driving your decisions. And if you believe because of your context that there is no way we would have used this information, of course you'd put it all in one bucket. And if the police come the minute you snap your fingers, of course you'd hand it over to the cops. But that's not everyone's context.
May I make two observations? Sorry, Gabe. Sorry, Michelle.
No.
One is just very glibly. You're absolutely right that like security and privacy come together. I think the challenge is because that conversation is necessary for engineers. Like in the context of this, like what do we do about privacy engineering? For engineers, they often hear those mixed messages and they conflate or confuse rather security with privacy. Like I would have a pretty firm line, which I think might not jive very well with Chris, unfortunately, but I think cryptographic privacy is not the same thing as privacy in the context of what we're trying to accomplish here. I would argue that crypto is predominantly a security tool when used well, not a privacy tool. And we could debate the merits of that probably for 10 hours, right? But the other point I was going to make, it's really interesting that I think one of the challenges about educating developers or engineers to the need for privacy is that the conversation often gets to where we are right now, which becomes philosophical and quite abstract. And one of the challenges there is engineers are looking for actually really tangible advice on how they apply this stuff. Because when we get into the conceptual ideas of privacy, I think we're all aligned on what those are. I agree with everything you've both said. I just wonder if an engineer is thinking about shipping stuff is sort of both understanding it and or willing to care enough to apply it. Because that's the challenge.
I will push back on your statement about crypto because I think it ignores something that Michelle said that I think is ridiculously important. But as the resident product guy in the room, Michelle, the thing that you mentioned a few minutes back was starting from personas, right? Like starting from personas, which means that you're going to start from the problems that person has. And so arguably, not forget arguably, crypto is an extremely useful privacy tool depending on the persona and the application of it. Blockchain is not a bad example of that. It's a shared secret, right? Asymmetric secrets or non-shared secrets are really shitty for privacy applications. Pardon my French. That's not French for you Europeans on the line. I knew you knew that already. The Americans, though, it might go right over them. Anyway, so like shared secrets are great for privacy application, but most engineers are still very unfamiliar with shared privacy, just cryptography as a general topic. Asymmetric and symmetric cryptography methods are the only thing, like, again, forget having spent any time in the crypto world, of which I've only, again, barely played one on television. Engineers, I don't know, have been educated well enough on how to apply crypto such that it isn't just applied as a security tool. If you took, now I'm just gonna play engineer in the spot. If you took your favorite flavor of differential privacy control and also combine it with a shared secret, you probably have a very, very, very well-working system that can only share what data you want to be shared with only whom. The problems are, of course, the implementation of that, and it goes back to the persona. Like, do you need that for every application? No. So if you apply it in the wrong way, it'll never be adopted. If you apply it to the wrong use case, it'll never see the light of day, and it might be overkill for some things. So I'm only going to push back in the context that, yes, crypto isn't a privacy tool in the way that it is applied broadly across personas, but it certainly is the best tool I can think of when combined with something like differential privacy, but again, specifically a shared secret crypto method versus just a non-shared secret.
Yeah, unfortunately, we are at the top of the hour. Jeff, I suggest, and that goes to everybody on the call, that we do a second session along this line. It was definitely too short to have this discussion. Maybe, do you want to start on our closing statement and then I'll end with my usual rant?
Yeah, we could go a little bit longer if people want to stay, but I guess we should probably. It's a long weekend coming up. I guess we should let everybody go, and we appreciate everybody's time. So I guess I'll say goodbye to all of our wonderful panelists, to Taylor, to Killian, to Michelle, to Gabe. And this has been episode 19 of Your Bytes, Your Rights on privacy engineering. We got a lot of great insight, I think, here. We didn't get to go as far and as deep as we might have. We probably would be here until 7 o'clock tonight. But again, I appreciate your participation on the panel, folks. And our audience appreciate you showing up today. So let's do it again. Let's try to have another one of these soon. So again, thank you for attending, and have a wonderful long weekend if you're here in the United States or celebrating the 4th.
What are we doing next week, Jeff?
Next week we're doing facial recognition face-off. So look forward to that. Okay.
Yeah, and I'll give my typical rant at the end. Maybe we can make that a thing. So everybody probably has heard the original sin speech at one point in time of the internet, and usually people refer to it as introducing advertising as a business model to the World Wide Web. And my contention is that we never built the World Wide Web. We built the commercial web as a result. But everybody.
AOL was the original sin. AOL wasn't the original sin. I feel like that was the original.
No, usually when people refer to the original sin in the context of the internet, they refer to the business model. They refer to advertising as the business model, even though, and we have moved on obviously from advertising as the business model, as most people on this call probably already know. What Google, Facebook, and the other companies are selling is not advertising. They're selling social engineering as a service, and that goes back to another term that people on the call again used very correctly, as in this is not really about privacy, it's about human agency, and as a result about self-determination. So point there being is, I think it's very important that we find a sexier term, because I think for most people the term agency is vacuous. Michelle, you have been a lawyer at some point in time, I guess, and I was a lawyer at some point in time. And so for me, this is self-explaining, but for most people, that's kind of a vacuous term. And so is the term privacy, because people have been indoctrinated into the idea that I check a box, and that means that my privacy is somehow protected, or I somehow agree with what is being done to it. But the larger point is really, we need to find a term that's sexy enough that people can get behind it.
How about freedom?
I think it's liberty, not freedom. But yeah, those go together. So maybe it's like liberty technologies. But in terms of the whole data ownership, I give long seminars around that. So in principle, we have the technology. So it's about mapped cryptographic primitives, and they're being rolled out right now. That's why I typically made the example of newly issued government issued credentials that are digitally native, i.e. driver's licenses that are stored on your enclave. And oftentimes, actually, it's the opposite from being more data extensive, because my expectation would be that I'm just gonna usually pass on a green check mark if it's a permission scenario, as in I need to show that I have the permission to pass, like a border agent scenario, or that I'm of a certain age, and you just pass on a green check mark, and that information just resides on my local wallet, so to speak. And there it's important to understand that wallets in the context are really browsers, data browsers. But yeah, I hope you can join us as another time, Jeff. I think we should put this topic back on the docket. That seems to have a lot of interest, and a lot of people, according to my count here, didn't end up making it because, as usual, we send out the notifications somewhat late. So we're gonna get better on that on a weekly basis. Jeff does an enormously great job. I don't know how and if and when he sleeps, aggregating all privacy laws around the planet, essentially, and everything that's related to that. And we're working on a very extensive GitHub library and a couple of legal engineering classes with a bunch of the larger schools that you would know to that end, because these topics are both important and they're urgent. And Michelle, I think you touched on that earlier. If we get this wrong, like our restarting the web scenario, then every one of us will live in a version of George Orwell's 1984 that George could never have imagined. It's going to be much, much, much worse than that, right? So thanks again, everybody, and join us next week for Biometric Face-Off. Send us anybody who has something interesting to say about that, and join yourself.
Murphy over at Forrester, every week she posts a deep fake of herself. She'd be awesome for the conversation.
Awesome. Yeah. Send us an introduction. Sounds good, Gabe.
I'll make sure Jeff figures out how to get to her. I'll talk to you guys soon. Cheers.
Talk to you soon, guys. I'll end the stream. Bye-bye.
Bye.